Gotcha.
I've been keeping track of weapon popularity stats for over a year for Monster Hunter World now. That's right, it's been that long. And although we've seen a casual shuffling of most of the weapons amongst the 14 ranks that they can hold, a few patterns have remained entirely constant. The longswords hold indefinitely onto first place on all platforms, typically with a large lead. Then you have a chunk of weapons that they hold onto ranks in the upper class, and they never leave the upper class. You have weapons that sit in the middle and never really leave the middle, and finally you have 3 weapons that have done consistently poorly since the launch of the game. That would be the gun lance, the lance, and the hunting horn, and a little bit the sword of shield a little bit, right? Why are these weapons so stuck in last place, and what can Capcom do to make them more enticing to players? Hello everyone, and welcome to my review of the weapon popularity in Monster Hunter World for July 2019. I do these every 2 months roughly because some time needs to pass before the ranks tend to shift at all. But this month, I want to do a special video about weapon popularity because we're in the final stretch before the release of the Iceborne expansion. I'll probably do a final weapon popularity right before Iceborne actually launches, but by then, there'll be no time left to speculate and to think about how the design of the weapons affect whether people use them or not. So first, I'm going to be speculating about why the weapons rank the way they do, and then at the end of the video, I'm going to be showing the month-to-month changes like I normally would, so if you're only here to see the monthly changes, you'll want to skip ahead. To get a better idea of how players are choosing their weapons, I like to think about a number of primary categories. Number 1, damage output, which is pretty straightforward. Which weapon does more damage? People do care about this. Number 2, complexity. This is about how difficult it is to learn to use that weapon. Some weapons are very intuitive, some weapons are very unintuitive and complex. Number 3, build cost, or how many rarity 8 decorations do I need for this build basically. Some weapons you can actually just supplement the rarity 8 decorations with good armor. Other weapons you really can't. You have to have those decorations, which means you're going to have played the game for a long time in order to unlock them. Number 4, personality. This one's kind of more of a subjective one. It's all about how good does this weapon look to you, and admittedly this is going to vary from person to person. You know, it's like a population thing. Number 5 is novelty. How mechanically cool is the weapon when you're using it? And that one's a little more objective than personality, I think. Let's go down the list and rank each weapon. We're going to be using the PlayStation 4 player usage data for July. Longsword comes in at 18%. Mind you, if each weapon is being played equally, it would only receive 7% usage. So 18% on the longsword is huge. Longsword, of course, is a very iconic weapon that immediately makes sense when you see it, so scores high on beauty, I would say, kind of like personality. Also, Foresight Slash rewards you for predicting an attack, and you get to build up to Spirit Blade 3 and then move into a very cool looking move called Helm Splitter, right? So right off the bat, I'd say kind of like personality and novelty of the weapon is scoring very high. Damage output on this weapon is also actually very great because you never really have to stop attacking. This is thanks to Foresight Slash. Also, build cost is a big deal here because Longsword doesn't actually require anything special to maximize your damage output. And complexity is not that bad for this weapon. It is somewhere in the middle for complexity. You know, you got to learn Helm Splitter aiming that, you got to learn Foresight Slash timing that, but other than that, it's actually pretty straightforward, and the weapon has a lot of range, so it's hard to miss. That's the first weapon on the list, and it consistently ranks at the top. Let's go ahead, we're going to quickly move down through the rest. The bow has always ranked high, and it's also one of the coolest weapons to use because you're rewarded for dodging through monsters' attacks. Is also one of the highest damage weapons in the game thanks to the power shot. The power shot is exactly the same as the heavy bowgun, it's the spread shot, it's the same thing. So you'll kind of notice heavy bowguns and bows rank extremely high because of power shot and spread shot, and these are just dealing tons of damage. But this doesn't actually stop it from ranking in second place, right? Like normally you want the Constitution Charm, you want the Spread Shot, you want the normal shot, you want Mighty Bow, right? There's no way to get Mighty Bow onto your build very easily. You want Crit Element, which admittedly you can kind of get Crit Element easier these days thanks to the QR weapons. But if you don't have the QR weapons, you might need the free Element skill, right? So there's all kinds of skills that go into putting together a high damage bow build, and yet it holds on to second place. Also, similar to the longsword, is a very, I would say, iconic weapon that humans have been using forever. Everybody knows what a bow is, so it's scoring well, I would say, both in novelty and in personality. Then we have the greatsword. greatsword has a different flavor from the longsword and the bow. It has very satisfying, chunky, slow swings, but it stands out for its extremely good damage output. It has some of the fastest clear times among speedrunners thanks to that aerial damage that it can deal, right? The greatsword is also one of the Monster Hunter's most iconic weapons. It's larger than life, but very easy to understand because it's literally just a huge sword, right? One of the things that stands out to me about the greatsword is how simple it is to use, yet it's still hard to master because landing its most powerful attacks takes a lot of practice. So does the ledge hopping, which is how you're doing all of these aerial attacks. After the greatsword comes the Charge Blade is in 4th place. In fact, not too long ago, Charge Blade was all the way in 2nd place on the Xbox. So this is a weapon that also tends to stay very high in the weapon popularity list. It also breaks a lot of our expectations for how the list is working. First of all, damage output actually is also very good on the Charge Blade, so at least this part is consistent. So far, all the weapons we've seen high on the list are high in damage. However, when we move on to complexity, Charge Blade is easily one of the most complex and difficult weapons to learn on this list, at least by my standards. I would put it in 1st place for complexity, by the way. Also on build cost, this is an expensive weapon. It wants you to build artillery, capacity boost, iron wall, focus, maybe guard up, probably guard up, right? And then also you can build all of the same melee damage skills you would need for the other weapons like normal, like crit boost, that's a rarity 8 decoration. Those are not going to be skills that you have access to very easily early on, not for an optimized build. Capacity boost in particular has no gamma armor that gives you this skill, similar to artillery, similar to guard up. You just have to have these decorations, right? And you might not have those decorations. This is why I call it an expensive build. Also, just the fact that you have to build those before you can focus on melee damage, right? It's a very skill-hungry weapon, right? In terms of weapon personality, I personally find the weapon kind of ugly. It's just kind of like a larger sword and shield, and it's really straightforward and simple, and you can have the axe mode, but you know, this is an area of is more of the subjective area of the weapon, but I personally don't find it to look too crazy good. Number 5, finally with the mechanics, I would say this is where the Charge Blade actually scores very high. You're basically rewarded constantly for charging your weapon up, right? You're filling up those files, and then you move into the Sade, which is one of the coolest heavy hitting moves in the entire game. So similar to the greatsword, this is a chunky feeling weapon thanks to that Sade, and you have some really cool and interesting combinations in its complex moveset. Okay, so although it's hard to learn, when you master it, it's also very satisfying. After the Charge Blade, we have the Dual Blades and the Insect Glaive. You know, we can talk about these very quickly. These are also something of an anomaly to me. I don't actually consider them the best for damage. However, they're both pretty cool with how much movement that they get. The Dual Blades being given a special dodge in Demon Mode, and the Insect Glaive especially being able to dodge into the air and actually being able to stay airborne for a while and literally dodge wars in the air. So moving around with these weapons has a special novelty to them, and so far on the list, none of the weapons we've seen have had terrible movement, right? When we look at the upper side of the list, all these weapons have pretty decent movement, especially even the Charge Blade, which is a shield weapon, right? The greatsword probably has the worst movement, but it does have that tackle. It's a very unique move that allows you to poise through the enemy's attacks, right? So all these weapons actually move fairly well. And finally, the QR weapons have also made it easier to build for some of these weapons on this list as well. So like when we're talking about the Dual Blades, they score high in the past, they score high now, and they've received a substantial boost because of the QR weapons. This is exactly what we would predict. We would predict that they would stay high. Then we have the light bowgun and the heavy bowgun. They're kind of floating around the middle of the pack. This is actually also fairly consistent over time. There are some interesting surprises to talk about here. I suspect light bowgun would have ranked more toward the bottom of the list if it wasn't for Kulve Taroth. Kulve is one of the most fought monsters in the game, right? You just grind the heck out of her. And the Styx light bowgun is consistently one of the most used weapons to fight her in stages 1, 2, and 3 when you're trying to deal thunder damage to her coat, right? That's because thunder ammo does an especially great job on her, and other weapons have trouble comparing to the ease of output that you're getting from this light bowgun. So if you were to just get rid of Kulve Taroth, I suspect the light bowgun would fall down a few ranks, and even in light of Kulve Taroth, light bowgun doesn't always hit right toward the middle. Sometimes it kind of falls down a little bit anyways. It still wouldn't be in last place though. The real problem for the light bowgun, in my opinion, is that after they nerfed the slice ammo, it has always struggled in terms of damage output when you compare it to the bow and the heavy bowgun. Those are the other ranged weapons, right? Except for when you're fighting a huge monster that is weak to elemental ammo. This is when the light bowgun actually does well, and again, that's Kulve Taroth. Mechanically, both bowguns, light and heavy, actually do a good job of not feeling like Call of Duty weapons. And interestingly, the light bowgun still has fast movement speed when it's sheathed, right? When it's drawn, I should say, along with the rest of the high-ranking weapons. So here we see that the light bowgun has a good target Kulftaroth, and it's not a slow weapon. Now this is where things get strange. The heavy bowgun finally falls into the lower half of the list, and this is actually a common area of popularity rankings for the heavy bowgun. However, it's also easily one of the hardest hitting weapons in the game, with two ammos in particular, the cluster bombs and the spread shot, easily allowing it to chew through literally any monster. So why in the world, no pun intended, isn't this weapon ranked any higher than mid-tier popularity, right? It floats right around mid-tier, and sometimes it falls below mid-tier. I wouldn't call it more difficult to use than the Charge Blade. I wouldn't say it's more expensive than some of the other weapons on this list. My suspicion is that players actually find it annoying how slow the sheath time is on the heavy bowgun, as well as the heavy bowgun's slow walking speed. So one of the things I noticed is a lot of the weapons that came in lower on the list are having a bit more trouble with the movement speed, right? The walking speed. These two problems combined are meant to balance the heavy bowgun, right? The sheath time and the walking speed. But it ends up making it feel cumbersome to use, even though it has access to a shield. In fact, without that shield, it's one of the easier weapons to die with. So the shield ends up being really important. However, in the end, I feel that this is what good balance looks like. You're a slow-moving weapon with big damage numbers, and look, the heavy bowgun is receiving, in this case, about 7% of the population, which is exactly on target. You should be getting about 7% of the population. That would be weapons that are so all equally popular, and let's assume they're all fun, that everyone's using them at about the same rate. Moving on to the hammer. This is consistently a weapon that has landed in the middle of the popularity list, sometimes a little higher, sometimes a little lower, right? It actually kind of traverses between those over time. I'm a big fan of the hammer for the same reason that I enjoy the greatsword. Large, chunky hitting weapons that are simple to execute, but hard to land on the monster. Funny enough, I did end up using this rather than the greatsword, specifically because I enjoy the extra movement, right? You get to move better when you're using the hammer. Also, after using this for a long time, I really enjoy how flexible the hammer is when you're using aerial attacks. But I also feel that the hammer and the greatsword, they're kind of in this competition with each other for being of a certain playstyle or archetype, right? This is the weapon where you charge it up and it does a big bang on the monster, right? A big smack, right? Now, ultimately, greatsword is going to be more popular because of its iconic appearance. It's also got the tackle, and I believe technically is going to be doing more damage because the aerial on the greatsword comes out very quickly. So you would actually expect greatsword to be more popular than the hammer, unless hammer ends up getting some extra oomph in Iceborne, which I believe it is getting. Next, we're going to talk about two weapons that have always consistently ranked in the middle or below it, Switch Axe and Sword and Shield. I think both of these weapons have a distinct problem. With the Switch Axe, you have a lot of high damage in-place combos that you don't get to finish because the monster is going to be too fast, or the monster is particularly hard hitting and you're scared of getting hit in the middle of your combo, which is basically all of the satisfyingly difficult monsters. They're all fast and they all deal high damage. Switch Axe's most unique attack, Zero Sum, also is basically a gamble whether you get to finish using it, so you just don't use it. You just use your in-place sword attacks. So this is the main problem I see with the Switch Axe. Capcom should have just had the Zero Sum attack, the latch, come out in a single 1-second burst, to be honest, and it should have just wiped out all the charge left over in your blade. That's what I would have done. Or if you're going to have the player, latch the way it does, give that player poise. Maybe he can take damage, but he actually stays attached so that he knows even if there's a risk of dying, he hasn't just wasted his attack. The Sword and Shield has an even worse problem in my opinion, and that's why you see it ranking even worse than the Switch Axe. Usually the Sword and Shield comes under the Switch Axe. So it has a very short range attack, and that's it. To me, it almost feels like it's in direct competition with the Charge Blade, except Charge Blade has tons of range on its attacks, and it's got the big, beautiful damage numbers coming from Sade. So if you know how to use Charge Blade, and then you swap over to the Sword and Shield, it often feels like you've just left the adult dinner table to eat at the kiddie table. You know what I mean? It's just kind of like poke, poke, poke. It's a very short-range weapon. I do want to see it gain more popularity during Iceborne. We'll have to see if that actually plays out. Neither Switch Axe or Sword and Shield really blow me away in terms of damage output either. Like, I love how much damage the Switch Axe does when you're standing in place. It's just, how long do you actually get to do that before the monster runs away or before you get interrupted? And the Sword and Shield, I don't really know what to do about the sword and shield. The short range, it kills me, man. It really gets me. Even the dual blades, they look like they're short range, but the dual blades have so much movement that they just stay on the target easier. You know what I mean? And this sword and shield has its approach where it does kind of like a jumping slash, but it's just, when you're not using that attack, a lot of the moves are very capable of missing. Finally, we have the gun lance, the lance, and the hunting horn. These guys are consistently at the bottom of popularity, and I feel I can explain exactly why based on the criteria we've been using for the other weapons. Number 1. Damage output on all 3 of these weapons is totally unremarkable, especially the hunting horn, in my opinion, which is just so mediocre when used in a solo hunt. I've done a lot of solo hunts with all these weapons, done a lot of multiplayer with all these weapons. With the hunting horn, here's the problem. You're spending your time resetting and upkeeping these buffs just to do less damage than if you had simply used a different weapon. It's very much like playing a hammer too, right? It's a blunt weapon, it has a little more range, but it's very much like using a hammer. You just hit the monster on the head over and over again, you get an occasional KO. It's a hammer that deals less damage though, which makes no sense to do, because you could just go play the hammer, right? Luckily, the hunting horn is receiving a lot of changes for Iceborne, alright? That's confirmed. I think these changes are going to resolve this problem and make the hunting horn have a bit more of an identity, I think so, as kind of a powerful weapon. And we'll talk about that in another video probably in the future. Number 2 is complexity. None of the weapons are as simple as the greatsword and the hammer. With the gun lance, you have to learn all about the shelling, and it actually has some complex combinations, right? If you're talking about the long combination. Hunting horn, you need to learn about stocking buffs and using them, and there's all kinds of shortcuts for stocking these buffs, right? And do I use an encore? As well as what do all these buffs do, right? It's been so long since I've been using the hunting horn, I forget. People get into the hunting horn and they're like, what are all these buffs? Are any of them good? And then there's the lance, which has probably the simplest of the 3 in terms of movesets, but it's going to have problems in other areas. So I think that the lance actually isn't too hard to learn, especially if you're not going to be like a master of it right away, but you can still get away with playing it decently, even if you're not super good with it. But in terms of complexity, it's just okay. It's about on par with a lot of the other weapons in the game. So number 3. We're going to talk about build cost. Hunting horn doesn't do bad with build cost, although it does cost a small decoration slot for the horn maestro skill that you wouldn't have had to build on something like the hammer. The gun lance and the lance are the 2 weapons that are scoring very bad here. They're annoyingly expensive to use. Consider this. You've been given these big ass shields, right? But in order to block something dangerous, you need to add a medium decoration called guard up, right? So we're talking about the supernova from Teostra. If you want to guard that, you actually have to have a skill called guard up. Or if you want to guard the belly flop, the body slam from Behemoth, you got to have guard up. So the part of the problem is guard up isn't even available on any good armor sets. Right there, you would lose a chunk of potential players because they don't have guard up. So because the movement speed on these weapons is so bad, you basically need the skill to fight something like the Behemoth, and then you end up not being able to build it easily with armor, you're losing a chunk of people. Gunlance also needs artillery and capacity boost, 2 more notoriously hard to build for skills thanks to the lack of good armor for them. Finally, both of these weapons are using the guard skill as well. So guard, kind of like artillery, is harder to come by, and it's used to have you be able to guard without losing too much stamina, without being knocked back too hard, so it's actually an important skill. So not only are these skills expensive for your build, meaning other weapons such as the longsword would just focus purely on damage skills rather than all this bullcrap fixes for your giant but still bad shield, but these skills you're adding to your build are also hard to come by thanks to the lack of good armor sets for guard up, artillery, capacity boost, and guard. It's absolutely awful, and it creates a situation that you would totally expect. These weapons are at the bottom of the popularity. Number 4, in terms of weapon personality, I actually relate a lot to the lance and the gun lance. I love the way they look. I love the shield. I love the ability to poke from a distance. All that's cool, right? However, the slow walking speed just kills it for me. In fact, I would love it if I could just drop the derpy shield entirely and hold this weapon in both hands. If you don't know what that would look like, go watch some gameplay of the Great Lance from Dark Souls 3. Go watch some PvP Great Lance. It's actually amazing. Dropping this giant shield would also mean I could focus once again on heavy damage builds rather than fixing my shield to just be adequate, which is how it should have been by default. All right, and finally, we're going to be talking about the novelty of the weapon, the mechanics of the weapon. Hunting Horn is actually a fairly novel weapon that has mostly been held back by low damage numbers. If you're going to make a slow weapon, make sure it does nice chunky damage. So in this case, I would say Capcom should have just made the hammer and the Hunting Horn on par in terms of damage. But when you're on a team, Hunting Horn would then give out, like the attack up extra large, and at that point, the Hunting Horn would be known for giving out more damage than the hammer, whereas the hammer maybe could still be known for handing out more mounts, right? Those are useful for the team, as well as KOs, which are also useful for the team. By the way, I would love it if Capcom just allowed you to KO more consistently with the hammer, especially when you're comparing it to sticky ammo on the bow guns. It's just embarrassing, right? The gun lance also does okay on novelty, but besides the fact that it's a very high cost build, I would say it's having kind of a problem with keeping up with your target, right? So the gun lance, no matter how you want to talk about evade extender or whatever, it has the worst maneuverability in the game. You walk slow, you don't have dash attack, you can hop, and that's about it. So you kind of have to deal with that. And then you have this conflict between the sharpness that you need for your melee attacks versus the shelling attacks that ruin your sharpness, which is very annoying. I don't like feeling that way. There should have been a more fluid connection, in my opinion, between shelling and melee combos, not to mention the very annoying worm stake, which comes out so slow that is almost never worth using, and this has still not been fixed in Iceborne, because in Iceborne it now sticks in the monster's head, sure, but it's still extremely slow, which means I'm never going to use it. Finally, the lance I think is the one that struggles most on novelty. It shouldn't surprise you with that, because the lance will sometimes swap places with Hunting Horn for very last place in the weapon popularity list. Counterattack on the lance is kind of like the signature move, but it's essentially a worse version of the longsword's foresight slash, especially since if you're playing with the longsword user, they're actually ironically going to trigger your counterattack early by swinging into you, and this actually causes the counterattack to believe that it's been triggered, and then you'll swing your lance out and you'll immediately be hit by the monster move that you were actually trying to counter. It's extremely annoying and very, very ironic that it works out that way. Triple high thrust is one of the least visually stimulating attacks in the game. Is basically just the same attack animation repeated 3 times. Actually, the gun lance wide shelling has this problem a little bit too. It's just shell poke, shell poke, shell poke, where the lance is just poke, poke, poke. Is even less exciting, and it's the basis of most of your damage output for the lance. So at least dash attack is pretty cool on the lance, especially if you learn to aim it and control it. However, the wind up at the beginning of the move kind of negates the bonus speed you get in this attack, especially when fighting in close range. So like you get a little bit of a bonus speed if the monster is further away, but other than that, it's just a move that has a big poke at the end, and then you go into your triple thrust. When you really look closely at these weapons, the gun lance is just going to poke shell, poke shell, poke shell. The lance gets to triple thrust 1,000 times for poor damage, and the Hunting Horn mostly sticks to note 3 and its performance. Now, a lot of weapons actually have the same situation of repeating an optimal damage moveset, but my point is, in a lot of those cases, those moves are either higher damage or just more exciting to use, or both. Compare Longsword Helm Splitter to Lance's Triple Thrust. It's just obvious right away which one is going to be more fun to pull off, and you can't really say anything about Lance's counterattack because Longsword actually has basically the same move with Foresight Slash. You could talk about the dash attack on the lance being cool, but really who needs it when you have good running speed on the longsword? You can actually run around, or you walk around I suppose, when your weapon's drawn. You can't do that with the lance. So you can see these weapons are actually scoring lower on pretty much all the criteria we set out, except for maybe personality, and that's mostly just because it's a subjective thing, right? So these are lower damage weapons that can be hard to learn, expensive to build for, and the movesets just aren't as exhilarating or as fast moving with weapons like the bow or chunky heavy hittings like the charge blade, the greatsword, the hammer. The fact that you have to put guard up and guard into the shield for it to be decent, even though you're already given slow walking speed for having that shield, is just very bad balancing. If Lance and Gunlance had built-in guard 5 and built-in guard up, they'd immediately feel more distinct and they'd immediately be more popular. As for the Hunting Horn, what it needed most was higher damage and new buffs, and we're confirmed to have both of these things coming in Iceborne, but for now we're still waiting to see if the Lance and Gunlance are going to be more playable when Iceborne launches. I'm predicting the Lance takes permanent last place if Capcom doesn't rebalance it more, We're still waiting to see what skills have been added to the game, as well as what armor is in the game. That's kind of a big deal too. Capcom could easily have a meta armor set that simply gives out guard up and guard, and then the whole issue is fixed, right? Like take the Draken armor set from the base game, and imagine it's exactly the way it already is, but also it gives you guard up and guard 5. This would have easily fixed the situation with the lance and the gun lance. Alright, well that kind of wraps up my assessment of why the weapons are popular the way that they are. The last thing I'm going to be doing in the video here is to show you each console's weapon popularity from this month and compare it to last month. Green lines means that the weapons have gone up in popularity, red lines mean that they've fallen. First, we'll start off with the Xbox. Well, you'll notice that the longsword of course is in first place, but it has the smallest lead on the Xbox than it does on the other two consoles. It's even more popular on the other two consoles is what I'm saying, okay? You'll also notice that the lance has been stuck in last place from March all the way over to July, which means there must be a lot of hunting horn users on the Xbox, or conversely, very few lance users. And then we see that the gun lance is in actually a nice spot in about 10th place, although that's not always the case with the gun lance. Oftentimes, weapons in last place are holding onto their spots by a small margin, and normally I see the gun lance go a little lower than that. On the PlayStation, one of the things that has always stood out to me when we're doing these weapon popularity data is how often the light bowgun gets used. It's actually always scored higher on the PlayStation for some reason compared to the PC and the Xbox, where it usually falls under the heavy bowgun. You'll also notice Sword and Shield is actually ranked lower than the gun lance here too, which speaks again about the problems that the Sword and Shield has had to deal with weapon popularity. Again, I think a lot of it just has to do with, it's kind of like a really short range weapon, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with that. And finally, we have the PC. One of the things I want to point out here is that although PC's weapon popularity data is newer than the Xbox and the PlayStation 4, because the game launched later, much later actually, it still follows the exact same pattern, with all the weapons falling mostly into the same rankings that we're used to seeing, which is why I trust this data to be representative of what people are actually choosing, and that there's actually a pattern of problems from these weapons. You'll notice once again that lance, gun lance, and hunting horn are at the bottom here, really struggling, with the sword and shield just ranking above the lance and the gun lance as it did in March for the PC. Alright, and that's the end of my weapon popularity review for July. Let me know if you made it all the way through. We'll probably take one last look just before the Iceborne launch, and hopefully by then we'll know more about any last minute weapon changes Capcom is going to be making to Iceborne. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.